I worked with the rudest coworker you could imagine. When I first got the job at Hudson and Pierce Marketing, I was thrilled. I'd been job hunting for months and finally, a position that not only matched my skills but also had a great reputation for growth. I've always prided myself on being professional, approachable, and a genuinely positive person in the workplace. I thought this job would be the fresh start I needed after a string of uninspiring gigs. The office itself was sleek, modern, and buzzing with energy. The open floor plan had a creative vibe, with collaboration zones, glass-walled conference rooms, and even a small cafe tucked in the corner. I remember walking in on my first day, coffee in hand, feeling the mix of nerves and excitement that comes with any new opportunity. That excitement didn't last long. Henry, my assigned team lead, was charming enough at first glance. Confident, quick with a joke, and approachable. He seemed like the type of boss you'd want on your side. But the other person I was assigned to work closely with was a different story entirely. I had met Lydia briefly during orientation, and she had this uncanny ability to make someone feel small without even trying. Her tone was always sharp, her eyes calculating, and she had a way of delivering critique that felt personal, even when it was supposedly professional feedback. At first I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe she was just having a bad day. But it quickly became apparent that Lydia didn't just dislike me. She seemed to actively take pleasure in making my life difficult. The first task I was given was to handle a social media campaign for one of our mid-tier clients. Nothing too fancy, just managing posts, coordinating with content creators, and monitoring engagement metrics. I had done similar work before, so I felt confident. But the minute I submitted my first draft for review, Lydia tore it apart. Not just pointing out minor mistakes or suggesting improvements, she went out of her way to belittle my decisions, often in front of the rest of the team. "Did you even read the client brief?" she asked, loud enough for half the office to hear. "Because this looks like something a high school intern would put together." My cheeks burned and I mumbled a quiet, "I followed the brief exactly," but she waved me off, rolling her eyes so hard I worried they might get stuck. I tried to shake it off. First days are rough, right? But Lydia's hostility didn't stop there. Over the next week, she began intercepting emails from clients, rewriting my copy, and even sending revisions as her own work. I could tell because I'd catch little inconsistencies in style and phrases I knew I hadn't written. What made it worse was the subtlety. Henry noticed some tension, but Lydia was clever. She knew how to make it seem like I was overreacting and imagining problems where there were none. Whenever I tried to bring it up to him, she would drop a smile, tilt her head, and say something like, "I'm just trying to help Sophia get up to speed. She seems a little lost." And Henry, being the type of manager who avoids conflict at all costs, would nod and suggest I try working more collaboratively. It was like a slow-motion nightmare. Every day, I came home exhausted, anxious, and frustrated. The office that had seemed so vibrant now felt like a minefield. I couldn't even bring up the issue with my friends without sounding petty. How do you explain that a coworker is actively sabotaging you in a way that seems imaginary to everyone else? By the end of the first month, I was walking on eggshells. Every time Lydia passed by my desk, I'd brace myself for a comment, a critique, or some sly remark. I started triple-checking everything I submitted, not because I was careless, but because I couldn't risk her twisting a small mistake into public humiliation. And yet, despite all of this, there was something unnerving about her confidence. Almost as if she thrived on this control. I remember one moment on a Friday afternoon, just before we were all about to leave. I had spent hours preparing a detailed content calendar for the next month. I was proud of it. It was comprehensive, creative, and in line with the client's brand. I walked over to her desk to show it to Henry for approval. Lydia looked at the document, skimmed a page, and then threw her hands up. "You actually expect him to approve this?" she said, loud enough for a few nearby coworkers to glance over. "This is mediocre at best. Sophia, you really need to rethink your approach, or you'll embarrass the whole team." I felt my stomach knot. My hands were shaking as I gathered my things and walked away. That night, I sent Henry a carefully worded email explaining my concerns. I kept it professional, avoided any accusatory language, and simply requested guidance. The reply I got back was frustratingly vague. "Thanks for letting me know, Sophia. Let's aim to work more closely on this next week. Keep up the good work." No acknowledgement of Lydia's behavior. No plan to address the problem. Just a polite dismissal. I realized then that if I wanted to survive in this office, I'd have to figure out how to deal with Lydia on my own. And that's when I started paying attention to patterns. Little things she did, the way she undermined me, how she manipulated Henry without him even noticing. It was exhausting, but I began to form a plan. The first real blow came during a client presentation. One of our bigger accounts had requested a new marketing strategy, and I was tasked with putting together the pitch deck. I worked late for days, making sure every slide was polished, every metric accurate, and every recommendation backed by solid data. I wanted to prove not just to Henry, but to the client that I could handle high-stakes work. The morning of the presentation, I arrived at the office early, reviewing the deck one last time. I even rehearsed my talking points in the empty conference room. I was ready. Then Lydia showed up. "Wow," she said, leaning against the doorway, smirking. "Big presentation today, huh? Hope you don't trip over your own ideas." I ignored her and tried to focus on the work. But as the team gathered in the conference room, Henry did something that immediately made my stomach sink. He handed Lydia the lead on the presentation. I froze. "Wait, Henry, it'll be good for you to watch this one, Sophia," he said, smiling. "See how it's done." I clenched my fists under the table, trying not to say something I'd regret. Lydia strutted through the slides like she owned the room. She emphasized points I hadn't written, rearranged my suggestions, and even mocked some of my phrasing under the guise of clarifying for the client. I wanted to scream. I wanted to point out that these were my ideas, my work, and that she had taken credit for every creative decision I'd made. But I couldn't. Not in front of the clients. Not in front of Henry. Afterward, the clients congratulated Lydia, praised the team effort, and asked if she could continue leading similar projects. I left the conference room barely able to hold back tears. That afternoon I went back to my desk, stewing in frustration. My mind raced through options. Complain to HR, talk to Henry again, or confront Lydia directly. All of them felt risky. HR had always been slow to act in my past jobs. Henry clearly wasn't willing to step in, and Lydia, well, confronting her could only make her more vindictive. And that's when the real toll hit me. The emotional weight of being constantly undermined, ignored, and disrespected started affecting me outside of work. I was snapping at friends over minor things, skipping meals and losing sleep. I couldn't let this continue. Something had to change. Over the next few weeks, I tried different strategies. I began sending emails with my work to both Henry and Lydia, ensuring there was a written record. I asked for clear deadlines and feedback in writing. And most importantly, I started finding allies and coworkers who had also noticed Lydia's behavior, who quietly confirmed that I wasn't imagining things. It was slow progress, and every day felt like walking through a gauntlet. But there was one thing I realized: Lydia thrived on control, and if I could remove her ability to manipulate situations, I could take back some of my power. I just didn't yet know how. After weeks of being undermined, I realized subtlety might be my best weapon. Lydia thrived in the spotlight and on twisting situations to her favor. So, I decided I wasn't going to confront her head-on. Not yet, at least. Instead, I'd work smarter. The first opportunity came during a routine client update meeting. This time, Henry had actually asked me to lead the discussion. I wasn't naive. I knew Lydia would try to interfere. But I'd prepared meticulously. Every chart, every graph, every recommendation was not only solid but visually striking. I even created a few interactive slides to make the presentation more engaging. As soon as Lydia walked in, she gave me a look that was a mixture of disbelief and disdain. She leaned over to Henry and whispered something, which he nodded at without responding to me. My stomach clenched. but I pushed it aside and started the presentation. For the first 10 minutes, she tried her usual tactics, interrupting, questioning phrasing, suggesting alternatives loudly enough for the team to hear. But this time, I was ready. I calmly explained my choices, backed them with data, and maintained eye contact with the clients. Every time she tried to twist my words, I countered politely but firmly, never raising my voice or showing frustration. By the end, the clients were nodding, taking notes, and even asking follow-up questions directly to me. Lydia's interruptions started to look petty, almost desperate. I could feel the energy in the room shift. When the meeting concluded, Henry complimented my preparation and initiative in front of the team. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. I realized something important. Lydia only had power if I let her control the narrative. As long as I stayed professional, organized, and confident, her usual tactics didn't work as effectively. After that day, I started subtly asserting my presence more. I volunteered for projects that required independent work, always keeping detailed records of contributions and decisions. I kept working with the other team members who had experienced Lydia's passive-aggressive behavior but had been too intimidated to speak up. Having even a few people who acknowledged what I was going through made a huge difference. But Lydia didn't back down. If anything, her behavior escalated. Emails would appear in my inbox, criticizing work I hadn't even done yet. She'd schedule last-minute meetings to review projects, then publicly point out minor errors. And the worst part? Henry continued to avoid confrontation. He was polite, professional, and confident in his leadership, but he was clearly conflict-averse. Every time I asked for intervention, he gave vague advice or suggested I try to get along with Lydia. It was exhausting. I'd be at my desk reviewing my notes for the day, when Lydia would stroll past and drop a comment like, "I hope you're not trying to take credit again, Sophia." That was a team effort, remember? And just like that, the anxiety would spike again. But the pattern I'd been observing gave me an idea. Lydia loved visibility. She craved recognition and control. If I could limit her ability to manipulate situations while increasing transparency, I could neutralize her power. I started making sure every deliverable had a clear trail. Emails copied to both Henry and other relevant team members, drafts saved with timestamps, and notes documenting meetings. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was creating a record that no one could twist. It wasn't glamorous, but slowly it worked. Projects began going smoother. Clients started praising my work directly. And Lydia's attempts to undermine me became increasingly transparent and almost clumsy. One day, a major client had requested a last-minute campaign revamp. The deadline was tight, and pressure was high. I volunteered to handle it, knowing Lydia would probably try to insert herself. This time, I had a plan. I'd prepare everything in advance, keep Henry informed with written updates, and subtly make sure the client recognized my contributions. The first day of the project, Lydia tried her usual intimidation tactics. She questioned my approach in front of the team, suggested last-minute changes, and even implied I didn't have the experience to manage such a critical account. I calmly responded, outlining each decision with evidence, and sent Henry a follow-up email summarizing the discussion. I noticed Lydia glaring, clearly frustrated that her usual tactics weren't working. By the second day, things were shifting. Henry started acknowledging my emails, replying with constructive feedback, and even praising my initiative. Other team members began noticing Lydia's attempts to take credit, whispering things like, "Did you see how she tried to claim Sophia's work?" It was subtle, but the tide was turning. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Lydia was still intimidating, still rude, but her influence was waning. Despite my progress, Lydia wasn't going down without a fight. Her tactics escalated in subtle, insidious ways. She started sending emails with exaggerated claims about mistakes I supposedly made. She began interrupting meetings more aggressively and making snide remarks about my competence. And worst of all, she seemed to sense my strategy, adapting her behavior to try to regain control. The breaking point came during a team brainstorming session. We were working on a major campaign pitch that would define the company's next quarter. I had prepared thoroughly, with charts, research, and a proposed strategy that aligned perfectly with the client's brand. Lydia, predictably, tried to hijack the meeting. She interrupted my presentation repeatedly, rewording my ideas as if they were her own, and making little comments designed to embarrass me. But this time I didn't falter. I calmly corrected her, referenced my prepared data, and even had a few team members quietly confirm points I made. The room was tense. Lydia's usual charm and dominance were faltering under the weight of clear evidence. She could no longer manipulate perceptions because everyone could see what was happening. For the first time, her confidence wavered. After the meeting, I returned to my desk, adrenaline still pumping. I knew Lydia would try something next, so I redoubled my efforts documenting every interaction. I kept copies of emails, tracked every contribution, and quietly collected statements from colleagues who had witnessed her behavior. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was building a case. That same week, Henry called me into his office. My heart sank, thinking I might be in trouble. But instead, he praised my professionalism, initiative, and the way I had handled Lydia's attempts to undermine me. "You've shown real leadership, Sophia," he said. "I know it hasn't been easy, but your work hasn't gone unnoticed. Keep it up." For the first time since starting the job, I felt vindicated. It wasn't about getting revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity and proving that competence and professionalism could overcome toxic behavior. Lydia, sensing her influence slipping, became increasingly desperate. Emails got sharper, interruptions more pointed, and her passive-aggressive remarks more frequent. But I was ready. Every interaction was documented, every achievement tracked, and I had allies who had witnessed her behavior firsthand. By this point, I had a clear picture of Lydia's tactics. She thrived on manipulation and on making others doubt themselves. I realized that the only way to truly stop her was to make her behavior undeniable, both to Henry and the rest of the team. I started carefully assembling a portfolio of evidence. Every email she sent that undermined me, every instance she tried to take credit for my work, every inappropriate comment in meetings, I documented it all. I even kept screenshots of Slack conversations and time-stamped versions of my drafts, proving that the ideas were mine. Next, I had to plan the exposure carefully. I didn't want this to be a public confrontation that looked petty or emotional. I needed it to be professional, objective, and impossible to dismiss. I also had to ensure I had allies ready to back me up. Over the past few weeks, I had quietly spoken with colleagues who had witnessed Lydia's behavior. Each of them agreed to confirm my observations if needed. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A major client requested a last-minute campaign overhaul, and Lydia was naturally assigned to lead the project. I had been working behind the scenes on research, strategy, and visuals, everything that would make the presentation successful. Henry was in a meeting when the client called, so Lydia and I were left in the office to prepare. I stayed calm. Every draft I sent to her, every recommendation I made, I CC'd Henry. Every decision was documented, every suggestion time-stamped. I let her attempt to assert control, but this time there was a paper trail. Nothing could be misrepresented. The presentation day arrived. I was seated at the conference table, laptop ready, documents in hand. Lydia, predictably, tried to dominate the discussion from the first slide. She interrupted, reworded my ideas, and even tried to gloss over data I had painstakingly compiled. But now, I had proof. Every time she misrepresented my work, I could refer to an email, a draft, or a time-stamped file. Henry noticed immediately. His polite, conflict-avoidant demeanor shifted to attentive and analytical. He asked clarifying questions, referenced the emails I had sent, and subtly reminded Lydia that this was a team effort. Her confident facade began to crumble. By the end of the meeting, the clients were praising the thoroughness, strategy, and creativity, none of which could be attributed to Lydia's input. I could see the realization in her eyes. The control she had relied on for months was slipping away. Later that afternoon, I requested a private meeting with Henry. I calmly presented the documentation, explained Lydia's repeated attempts to undermine me, and referenced the witnesses who could confirm her behavior. I wasn't angry. I was professional, objective, and factual. Henry listened, nodded, and asked a few questions. And then he said something that made me breathe a little easier. I had no idea it was this severe. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Sophia. We'll address this appropriately. That evening, I went home exhausted but relieved. For the first time since I started this job, I felt like I was in control. Lydia didn't know it yet, but her reign of quiet intimidation was ending. The next week, HR called Lydia in for a formal meeting. I wasn't present, but I knew from whispers around the office that the evidence I had provided had made a clear impact. Lydia tried to downplay things, of course, but the documentation, timestamps, and witnesses made it impossible to ignore. From that moment on, things began to change. Lydia was reassigned to another department, effectively removing her influence from my team. Henry was more attentive, more supportive, and more proactive in managing the office environment. My colleagues, who had quietly observed the entire saga, were more willing to collaborate and support one another openly. The atmosphere in the office transformed. Meetings became productive rather than a minefield. Projects moved forward smoothly. And I discovered something I hadn't realized before. The satisfaction of proving yourself isn't just about winning. It's about reclaiming your peace of mind and standing firm against someone who thrives on undermining others. A few months later, I led another major client presentation, entirely solo. This time Lydia wasn't in the room. I walked in with confidence, delivered the pitch flawlessly, and watched as the clients reacted enthusiastically to every recommendation. The difference was night and day. I'd learned something important through all of this. Toxic coworkers can be relentless, but when you combine professionalism, strategic thinking, and quiet documentation, you can turn the tables. It wasn't easy, but the result was worth every stressful day. And the best part? I finally felt free to enjoy my job again. I could focus on creativity, collaboration, and growth instead of constantly bracing for sabotage. I even looked back at the months of struggle with a sense of pride. Lydia, as I heard from office chatter, was no longer able to exert the same control anywhere else. She had been forced to face the consequences of her actions in a professional setting, and her reputation had taken a noticeable hit. Justice, in a quiet but effective way, had been served out. As for me, I built stronger relationships with my team, gained the respect of clients, and rediscovered my confidence. And when I walk past Lydia now, I can smile and remember that staying calm, being methodical, and maintaining integrity will always win in the end. Some battles feel exhausting, impossible even. But when you approach them with strategy, resilience, and patience, the outcome can be more than victory. It can be freedom.